If you're waking up stiff and sore most mornings, what you ate yesterday is part of the reason. Not the whole reason, but a bigger part than most people realize, and probably not the part you'd guess. Because the foods that drive joint inflammation aren't always the obvious ones. They're not just the cookies and the soda. Some of the worst offenders are things people eat thinking they're making a reasonable choice. Things that have been marketed as healthy for so long that questioning them feels counterintuitive. That's what this video is. 8 specific food categories, what they're doing inside your joints, why the effect is worse after 60 than it was before, and what to actually do about it. Here's the thing that makes this different from every other foods to avoid list you've seen. The goal isn't to hand you a list of things to feel bad about eating. It's to explain the mechanism, what's actually happening in your body when you eat these foods. Because once you understand that, the choices start making themselves. Inflammation isn't random. It's not just something that happens to unlucky people. It's a biological process your body runs every single day, and the food you eat is one of the most direct inputs into how much of it you're producing. After 60, that process runs hotter and slower than it did before. Harder to turn on, harder to turn off. Which means the foods that were merely suboptimal in your 40s are doing something meaningfully different to your joints in your 60s and 70s. We're going to get through all 8. Some of them you'll recognize. At least 1 or 2 are going to surprise you. Let's start with what's actually happening in your joints. Because most people have a vague sense that inflammation is bad, but they don't know exactly what it's doing or why food has anything to do with it. Your joints are lined with a thin layer of tissue that produces synovial fluid, the lubricant that keeps bone from grinding on bone. That fluid also carries nutrients into the cartilage, which has no blood supply of its own. It depends entirely on that fluid to stay healthy. When inflammation is chronically elevated in the body, not the acute kind that helps you heal a cut, but the low-grade, always-on kind that comes from diet and lifestyle, that joint environment becomes hostile. The fluid changes. The cartilage gets less of what it needs and more of what it doesn't. And unlike most tissue in the body, adult cartilage doesn't meaningfully regenerate. What's lost is largely lost. That's the part that changes the stakes. After 60, this process is more consequential for a specific reason. The immune system becomes less precise with age. The signals that normally switch inflammation off, that tell the body a threat has been handled and it's time to stand down, become slower and less effective. So chronic, low-grade, diet-driven inflammation doesn't just persist, it compounds. What used to resolve in a day or two now lingers, and the joints are absorbing that signal continuously. Most people don't connect what they ate last Tuesday to how their knee feels on Friday. But the inflammatory compounds that food triggers don't clear overnight. They circulate. They land in joint tissue. They alter the fluid environment that cartilage depends on. The stiffness you're managing on Friday morning is partly Tuesday's lunch. I want you to picture something specific, not a dramatic scenario, just an ordinary morning. You wake up at 6 a.m. Your shoulder aches before you've moved. You lie there for a minute, deciding whether to roll over or just get up. When you do get up, you sit on the edge of the bed first. You don't go straight to standing the way you used to. You wait. You've learned to wait. Then you shuffle to the bathroom, holding the wall at the corner. You try to open the medicine cabinet, the small handle, and your fingers don't cooperate the way you need them to for the first 10 minutes. Your spouse is downstairs. You don't mention it. You've stopped mentioning it because it's just the morning now. This is just what mornings are. That's not aging, that's inflammation. Chronic, dietary, manageable inflammation. The research on this is clear enough to be actionable. Specific foods reliably raise inflammatory markers in the blood, measurably within hours of eating them. Other foods lower them. For people over 60 with joint pain, the difference between a high inflammatory diet and a low inflammatory one shows up in morning stiffness, in grip strength, in how long it takes to feel functional after waking up. You can't undo cartilage damage that's already happened, but you can stop accelerating it. And for most people, that starts with these 8 foods. Let's go through them. Food 1. Added sugar. Not fruit sugar. not the natural sugars in a glass of milk. Added sugar, the kind stirred into processed food during manufacturing, and the kind you add yourself. Sodas and sweet tea, yes, but also the places you wouldn't expect. Commercial salad dressings, pasta sauces, instant oatmeal, flavored yogurt, most granola bars. It's in foods that don't taste sweet. When you consume added sugar, your body's immune system responds by releasing inflammatory signaling chemicals, compounds that circulate through the bloodstream and amplify the inflammatory state throughout the body, including in joint tissue. This isn't a slow process. It happens within hours of eating. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition identified this mechanism clearly, and the Arthritis Foundation lists added sugar as the single most inflammatory food category for people with joint conditions. The volume and frequency are where it becomes a real problem. Most people on a standard American diet hit that inflammatory threshold not once a day, but 3 or 4 times. Breakfast cereal, then a flavored drink at lunch, then ketchup with dinner, then a small dessert. Each dose seems modest. Together, they keep the inflammatory signal running without interruption. Food 2, refined carbohydrates. White bread, white rice, white pasta. Anything made from grain that's been stripped of its fiber and processed into a fine, rapidly digestible form. Most commercial crackers and cereals fall here too. The problem is what happens to blood sugar. Refined carbs break down fast, faster than the body can use the glucose. So blood sugar spikes sharply. That excess glucose doesn't sit still. It binds to proteins throughout the body, including the proteins that make up joint cartilage, and forms compounds that stiffen tissue, impair repair, and trigger inflammatory responses in the joint. Research published in Nutrition and Metabolism found that these compounds accumulate specifically in bone, joint, and muscle tissue, and that their buildup plays a direct role in the development of osteoarthritis and joint degeneration as we age. This isn't a minor dietary tweak. Choosing whole grains over refined ones and reducing the overall portion of grain-based foods at most meals is a meaningful intervention for joint health. Food 3, vegetable and seed oils. This is the one that surprises people most. Corn oil, soybean oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, canola oil. These are in almost every processed food, every restaurant kitchen, every bag of chips, and most commercial salad dressings. They've been positioned for decades as the healthy alternative to butter and animal fats. The problem isn't that they're fats, it's the type, specifically how high they are in omega-6 fatty acids relative to omega-3s. Your body uses fatty acids to produce either pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory compounds. Omega-6 fats tip the balance toward inflammation. Omega-3 fats tip it toward resolution. The ratio between them in your diet determines which way the body leans. Research shows the ideal ratio for controlling inflammation is approximately 4:1 omega-6 to omega-3, or lower. The typical Western diet runs at 15:1 to 20:1. That's not a small imbalance. That's a structural condition that keeps the inflammatory system chronically tilted in the wrong direction. A study in biomedicine and pharmacotherapy found that reducing the ratio to just 2 to 3:1 measurably suppressed inflammation in rheumatoid arthritis patients. The dietary shift required to get there starts with these oils. The move is olive oil for cooking and dressing, and cutting back on packaged and fried foods that rely on the seed oils above. Not elimination, reduction. Food 4, red and processed meat. This one carries 2 separate problems, and it's worth being precise about both. The first is saturated fat. Red meat, particularly fatty cuts and processed versions like sausage, bacon, and deli meats, is high in saturated fat, which research has consistently linked to elevated inflammatory markers, including in joint tissue. The Arthritis Foundation specifically identifies saturated fat as a trigger for inflammation in fat cells, which amplifies the inflammatory load throughout the body. The second problem is less talked about. When meat is cooked at high heat, grilled, broiled, fried, it generates large amounts of those same tissue-damaging compounds we discussed in relation to refined carbs. A large grilled steak produces far more of them than the same amount of meat cooked slowly in liquid. The method matters almost as much as the food itself. a prospective study of more than 25,000 people between the ages of 45 and 75, found that high red meat consumption was significantly associated with developing a painful inflammatory joint condition, not just worsening existing joint pain, but contributing to the development of it. I see this clinically. A patient, a man in his late 60s, retired, otherwise active, came in with bilateral knee pain that had been escalating for about 2 years. He'd been told it was osteoarthritis, which was accurate. He was frustrated because he felt he was doing everything right, exercising regularly, keeping his weight stable, taking his supplements. When we went through his diet in detail, the pattern was immediately clear: grilled red meat 4 or 5 nights a week, processed deli meat most lunches, no particular excess in any other category, just a sustained, very high intake of 2 of the foods that generate the most of these tissue-damaging compounds. We reduced those specifically, without dramatic changes to the rest of his diet. Within 6 weeks, his morning stiffness had dropped significantly. He told me he'd stopped gripping the stair railing on the way down. The change wasn't eliminating meat, it was reducing frequency, switching to lower heat cooking methods and replacing some servings with fish. That's a manageable shift. Food 5. Fried foods. Frying is the most inflammation-generating cooking method available. The combination of very high heat, fat, and protein creates a concentrated burst of tissue-damaging compounds with every batch. French fries, fried chicken, donuts, anything that goes in a fryer. Research supported by the National Institute on Aging found that dry heat cooking methods like frying increase the formation of these compounds by more than 10 to 100 times compared to uncooked or moist heat cooking. That's not a marginal difference, and those compounds don't stay in the food, they're absorbed and circulate, accumulating preferentially in joint tissue. The additional problem is the oils used for frying. Commercial kitchens and most home frying use exactly the seed oils from Food 3, corn, soybean, sunflower, which simultaneously loads the body with oxidized, high omega-6 fat. A serving of fried food is delivering 2 of the most inflammatory inputs at once. Frequency is the lever. The joints can manage occasional. Regular is where the damage compounds. Food 6. Alcohol, and specifically what too much actually means at this age. The evidence on alcohol and joint inflammation is more nuanced than most people expect, so this deserves care. Moderate consumption, roughly 1 drink per day for women, up to 2 for men, appears to have a relatively neutral effect on most forms of inflammatory joint disease, and some research suggests it may even reduce certain systemic inflammation markers at those levels. What changes the picture is excess. Regular heavy drinking damages the gut lining, disrupting the barrier that keeps bacterial byproducts out of the bloodstream. When that barrier is compromised, the result is body-wide inflammation that lands everywhere, including joints. Separately, alcohol raises uric acid levels in the blood, and for people with gout, which is one of the most acutely painful forms of joint inflammation, even moderate drinking can trigger a flare, and heavy drinking reliably does. The threshold isn't extreme, more than 2 drinks per day on a consistent basis, in someone over 60 whose liver clearance is already slowing and whose gut is already more vulnerable, is enough to shift the balance meaningfully. The question worth asking is whether alcohol is functioning as an occasional social part of life or as a daily habit. Those are different situations with different implications. Food 7. Trans fats. The FDA banned artificial trans fats, the kind created through industrial partial hydrogenation of vegetable oils, from the U.S. food supply in 2018. So this entry needs some precision because the landscape has changed. Artificial trans fats are largely gone from most major brand products, but largely is doing real work in that sentence. Some commercially prepared baked goods, certain fried foods at smaller restaurants, and some imported products still contain meaningful amounts. Checking the ingredient list for partially hydrogenated oil remains a worthwhile habit because the label can legally say 0 grams of trans fat per serving while still containing it if the serving size is small enough. The reason trans fats belong on this list is that they are the most reliably inflammation-causing type of dietary fat identified. Even in small amounts, they elevate inflammatory markers and disrupt the cell membrane function that helps regulate the inflammatory response. For joint tissue already under pressure from other dietary sources, they're an avoidable additional load. Where they remain most common, commercially fried foods, baked goods from bakeries or convenience stores, and some frozen prepared meals. Not everywhere, but worth checking. Food 8. Ultra-processed foods. This is the category that ties everything else together. And it belongs last because understanding the first 7 makes this one obvious. Ultra-processed foods, packaged snacks, instant meals, breakfast bars, commercial cereals, most fast food, aren't simply convenient food. They're delivery vehicles. They deliver refined carbohydrates, added sugar, high omega-6 seed oils, and in some cases trans fats simultaneously, in ratios optimized for palatability rather than health. A single packaged snack can hit 4 of the 7 categories above in one serving. The particular danger is the health washing. Whole grain, low fat, made with real fruit. These labels are not regulated against the inflammatory profile of the product. A low-fat granola bar sweetened with high-fructose corn syrup and bound with soybean oil is a high-sugar, high omega-6 refined carbohydrate product with a green leaf on the package. The label describes what's absent. It says nothing about what's present. For people over 60 managing joint pain, ultra-processed foods are where most of the unintentional inflammatory load comes from. Not from knowingly eating poorly, from eating conveniently with products designed to be purchased rather than to be genuinely nutritious. The ingredient list is more useful than the front of the package. A short list of recognizable items is a reasonable signal of a lower inflammatory product. A long one full of additives, modified starches, and multiple oil sources is worth a second look. That's all 8. The common thread across every one of them is inflammation, either by triggering inflammatory signals directly, by generating compounds that damage joint tissue over time, or by disrupting the fat balance the body uses to regulate its inflammatory response. Reducing any one of these makes a difference. Reducing several makes a significant one. Subscribe if you found this useful. I'll keep making these. Take care of your joints.